Alexa, play Disruptive FM.
You'd like to listen to Disruptive FM, right?
Yes.
Press play. He's the voice of the intersection of marketing, tech, and popular culture. Thinking is his commodity. DJ, data punk, stylish sock collector, and author of the book Disruptive Marketing. Geoffrey Colon is your host of Disruptive FM, the marketing podcast for eccentric minds.
If it's Friday, it's another episode of Disruptive FM, the marketing podcast for eccentric minds. I'm your host, Geoffrey Colon.
And I'm co-host Cheryl Metzger.
And we are back with another new episode, episode 64. And we love all your feedback. Keep the emails coming. And of course, you can tweet to us on Twitter at DisruptiveFM. Cheryl is on Twitter at TheRealCherylM. And I'm on Twitter at DJ Geoffe. So Cheryl, brand activism, a lot of activism in general going on out there in the United States and around the world for that matter. Are people going to bore of this quickly? How tired are you of this topic? And also the bigger question, should every brand activate this strategy?
It's so funny. I feel like, especially as marketers, this topic's become really big, especially right after the Super Bowl. You know, all of us advertisers and marketers were watching all of the ads, and it just became really clear that activism was the word du jour of brands, of advertising strategy. And I think, beyond the Super Bowl ads, we started seeing, the delete Uber effort that led to Lyft donating $1 million to the ACLU. We're seeing, for instance, today in Chicago, there's a No Immigrants Day where different businesses, and this is around the country, obviously, different businesses have closed down to show how much we all depend on immigrant labor. I know our local restaurateur, Rick Bayless, Top Chef fame, he closed all of his restaurants today as part of that. And Starbucks, of course, also got into the action with their employees. It seems like something that's really growing right now in terms of businesses getting on board, taking action. I think brand activism is definitely going to be here for a bit, especially in such a charged political climate. But I don't think it's right for every brand. And I don't know that people can sustain this level of intensity all the time. And so, I think even though it's going to be a trend for a while, we're already starting to see some perception of the fatigue people are feeling. And I know you and I were talking about SNL and our thoughts on that Cheetos sketch the other day. What were your thoughts about the Cheetos sketch?
My take on it, I was laughing because, and this, Cheryl, from us being in this world of, working at an agency, you're at a pitch and you have good ideas. And of course, the good ideas are usually the ones they frown upon. They want the cheesier ideas, no pun intended. And in this skit, it just was hilarious because they wanted things that were politically charged, which made absolutely no sense for a brand like Cheetos, which is what made it so funny because it's like, yep, of course, this is what happens in sort of capitalist economics. People try to use things to make a buck, but I agree with you. It's not really. I think people can see through a lot of this now. I think they some brands it's really relevant. It's part of their DNA, but the ones that are just doing it to do it, just to sort of make a quick statement, it's almost a little absurd.
Yeah, that it would have jumped the shark if Cheetos is trying to make a big political statement. just doesn't really match to their brand, to their audience. But it does beg the question, does every brand now have to play this role, or, is it opportunistic and exploitative? And I think that's a really interesting debate that's going to continue, I think, into the next year or two, or however long this activism streak continues. Because on the one hand, brands have platforms, brands have attention, and brands have a lot of money. And so, maybe it's noble of them to use that power for good or to protect, who they may feel are the weakest. On the other hand, like in the Cheetos kind of parody, it could also be opportunistic and exploitative to, there are all these raw emotions people are feeling. And for a brand to tap into that just to sell you more stuff, it'll make people even more distrusting of brands at a time when trust is really the currency. I feel like trust is worth more than gold right now because it's such a rarity. But when I was thinking about this topic, there are a couple of things I think a brand manager could think about in terms of, or even a CMO, if they're trying to decide what the role is for their brand when it comes to activism. I really think it's about starting with what your values are. And, you and I, we hear a lot about brand values. But one of the things that I think is happening now is people are thinking about what values they want to take action on, what values are worth defending and what values are worth fighting for. So I think really, companies should start by re-examining what their values are. What does their leadership believe? What do their employees believe? What do their customers believe? And then what's that threshold for action? So, what are the values? What's going to trigger the company to take an action to defend those values? Are you going to react? Or are you going to be proactive? I think these are some of the decisions the leadership needs to make. And then when you look at the different ways companies have been interacting, from an activist perspective, I think it's about identifying your levers. Where are the places where your business can actually have an impact? So are you a small business? Maybe you can have an impact in contributing to your local community. Are you an IBM or a Google where you already have the ear of politicians? Mm-hmm. Well, then you have impact directly on politics. Can you have an impact through the policies that you have towards your employees? Do you have an impact with your ad dollars? Do you have an impact by charging up your followers and customers? So I think that's a really big question for companies to ask themselves is, where are their levers to leverage to have an impact, to take action? And then what's the right role to play in taking action? So does it align with your brand to be a leader? Does it make more sense for your brand to participate? Let's say the hashtag activism, maybe your brand participates in it. You're not necessarily launching it. Or, and I think there's some interesting examples of this, is your role as a brand to give people a break from all of the stress and tension? Do you give people a place to breathe easy? And I actually think the Super Bowl was a great example of that, where the actual event itself very much wanted to stay apolitical so that people could just have a space where they could focus on the enjoyment of the experience. So anyhow, my advice to any CMO sort of thinking about brand activism would be examine your values, determine, that kind of threshold for action, identify your levers, and then determine what the right role is to play.
It goes back to episode 63, our last conversation where we talked about personas and how a lot of times CMOs, marketers, they don't really know who their customers are. So they're making some decisions where they might say, well, for the brand, this doesn't make sense for us, so we're gonna not do anything. We're not going to say anything. And I think if they have a good understanding of who they are as a brand and also who their customers are, I mean, it's okay to stay on the sidelines, I guess, or be apolitical. Because if it doesn't make sense, it doesn't make sense. I guess the interesting thing, though, was the brands that thought, hey, the decisions we're going to make, we're going to do these things, that backfired. A good example, obviously, Uber, who just from the CEO, Travis Kalanick, being on Trump's advisory or economic panel, so to speak. I mean, that got a lot of people really, really upset. And it was almost an example of, wait, you don't even know who your customers are. You're in these urban areas with a lot of people who work in the creative economy. And not to say that they all lean a specific way politically, but many of them do. So how does that look to all of them? Especially in this world now, Cheryl, and I definitely want your opinion on this, where social media doesn't give context to why we do what we do. If you only see, oh, this person is on this particular advisory board, or they are working with this person, and it is just par for the course in social media to get very angry because that is how we react on social media. In some respects, it reminds me a lot of, and I keep talking about this movie, and I think everyone should watch it, Hypernormalization. Adam Curtis from the BBC did it, where, artificial intelligence in its elementary form is you shouting into a box, so to speak. In this case, you're typing into a server, and the machine learning is typing back what you're typing in a different format. So by getting angry, everyone else is also getting angry with you.
Yeah.
And it just feels natural. It's also the other reason why humor works so well, because we like to laugh collectively. Or empathy and sentiment can also feel good in those environments because, people like to actually maybe cry together or feel a certain emotion together. It's quite interesting, though, how, there really isn't a lot of context. So I think that's another thing brands have to really consider when they make specific moves in this area around brand activism. How is that going to look and feel to everyone else when most people don't read anything beyond headlines, when most people don't really dive deep on why brands make the decisions that they do? I mean, this past week, the CEO of Under Armour had to take a full-page ad. Think about that, a full-page ad in the Baltimore Sun about his comments about, the current commander-in-chief. I mean, we've never really been in this sort of period before. I mean, what's your take on how people should navigate some of this in terms of, the statements that they make and maybe how they should respond, how they should respond to it, knowing that people don't really understand context that well?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a great point that you're making, because I think what social media in particular has trained us all to do, there are two things. It's trained us to read less because we just scan headlines now. Our news feeds basically overwhelmed us with information, so we're forced to just scan all the time instead of ever read anything beyond the headline. Yeah. So we're never looking for the full picture. We're always just reacting to a very small piece of the picture. And then the other thing I think it's trained us to do is focus on getting reactions, because, I remember seeing a piece, I think it was from the New York Times actually several years ago, about what makes content share worthy. And unsurprisingly, it's intense emotions. So it's always intense feelings of happiness, sadness, like if it makes you laugh out loud, if it makes you cry, or if it makes you angry, those are the things people will actually take an action and give you a reaction to. And we all, like Pavlov's dog, respond to getting a like or getting a share or getting a comment. And so we've all been driven to share and to react in ever more intense ways in order to play this gratifying game on social of like getting likes and giving likes. And it's all about, triggering a strong emotional response. The interesting thing too, as you were talking with brand activism, it's kind of to the point I was debating earlier, is it noble or is it ignoble? And I saw this great quote recently where they said, there's no room for humility when a brand does a good deed. They're always Larry David and never the anonymous donor. And I thought that was hilarious. But it occurs to me that that's exactly the same as people on social media, in that we all are trying to project an image, and we're all trying to communicate that we're better than who we really are. So we all have righteous indignation about politics. We all have socially acceptable beliefs and views. And the fact is, it's obviously true. Yeah. And social is not a place to demonstrate humility, because that you can't show humility. It would be, self-nullifying. So, you're not able to show a different side on social. And it actually raises another topic in my mind of dark social, and the fact that there are a lot of conversations that people don't want to have in public.
That's right.
And there's a whole other side to people's personalities that they don't post in all of these different places. They'd rather, they're kind of discreetly messaging with each other. And I feel like that shows that there's so much that's missing in the conversation, because what brands are publicly, what people are publicly, is not who they are privately, or at least not the full picture. The stories that are reported are not all the full picture, or the headlines at least aren't the full picture. And I think the more people realize that duality, that there's the public and private side, or that there's a lot of different angles on the same story, a lot of different pieces to the puzzle. In other words, the more we actually push up against this oversimplification that social media has forced us into, and start looking at how complex things are again, how complex people are.
Yes.
Then I think there will be maybe a return to some sort of humanity, because, I look at, when you talk about social media posts, you'll see someone, tweet or write a post on Facebook that you don't know, and you think, wow, this person is crazy. Or, they're in all caps, and you said, this person must be really angry. But if you actually knew the person, they're not like that at all.
Yes.
In real life.
That's right.
So, it really does color, or the contrast that I find between people that I know how they are in real life and how they are on social. It's just unbelievable to me. So I think either we wake up from that, or we just succumb to it and become ever more polarized. But to the point earlier about brands doing it, I feel like people get exhausted pretty quickly from having to sustain intense emotions all the time. So I think they're going to get tired of brands doing it. And I think we're starting to get tired of people doing it. I think we're all kind of feeling in the zeitgeist this exhaustion with the situation we've been in.
It's interesting too, because social media is it is this reflection of people, so to speak. And it doesn't capture that reflection really well, as you noted, because the way people behave, the way someone behaves in real life is very different from how they may behave online. Mm-hmm. And that really goes back to a lot of studies also on how we all behave as individuals. I mean, Susan Cain, who wrote the book Quiet, which I really love, said something in the book that was really interesting. A lot of times we think that people are 100% pure extrovert or 100% pure introvert. And she said, that's actually not true at all. We're a combination of those things, just like people who say I'm either, all left brain or all right brain. Well, first of all, your brain wouldn't function because you need both sides. So, one might be, you may use one side a little bit more than the other, but we need both sides. And it's the same thing with the extrovert introvert argument. And I think this applies really well to the social media world, where, hey, just because someone has posted things that make their life look amazing, there's probably that may be an escape mechanism for the fact that they might be going through a lot of hardship that you don't see offline. Yeah. And I think it's quite interesting because there have been a couple of people and there have been a few brands that have really tried to push the envelope. And I remember we talked about this a couple of years ago as a trend of, showing some of those flaws, showing like, hey, we make mistakes because we have people that work here and people make mistakes and we own up to that and it's totally fine. what hasn't really happened in a lot of these scenarios, I think, again, depending on what, how you approach the situation, I think the one thing that's interesting is we don't really want to give anyone the benefit of the doubt when they do have a response like, hey, I said some things that really are, maybe didn't come across the right way. So now I'm going to publish a full page ad in the Baltimore Sun explaining, what I meant by this. Or if I'm Mark Zuckerberg, I'm going to write a 6,000 word blog post on why fake news is bad for the world and what our responsibility is at Facebook. Or I'm going to apologize and step down from the council that I was on and donate money because to specific causes because I realized that maybe that came across the right way. But it actually reminds me of an incident that happened a couple of years ago, which I think a lot of brands can learn from and people can learn from, and we're going to see a lot of this now in this sort of this brand activism era, where Microsoft's CEO Satya Nadella, he had just taken the helm and he was asked to speak at the Grace Hopper conference, and some women asked a question, hey, how do you go about getting a raise, or what should you do? And he used his own experience to explain something that just came across as, what do you mean wait in line and everything will work out for itself?
Right. Mm-hmm.
And instead of saying like, hey, that came out the wrong way, he actually came back later and said, that was the, here's what I should have said. I should have had a little bit more empathy for people in the situation. Didn't realize it was going to hurt people's feelings, but I learned from it. And I think, I want to grow from it. I think the thing about brand activism and social media being this toxic mix is social media doesn't allow people to really grow. I mean, if you make a mistake there, you're punished and that's it. You have no ability to ever grow whatsoever because you just have a lot of people shouting and they're going to drown you out. I mean, we've all experienced this. So I think that's another area that brands, might scare brands from ever wanting to become active, Cheryl, because they just may say, well, if we make a misstep, we might just get killed.
Yeah.
But for other ones, they may say, hey, but this is very important for us. And this is the cause that we believe in. And maybe there is specific things and initiatives that they really want to tie themselves to because it makes sense for their brand. And all I basically say to them is, just be prepared for when you make missteps to just say, hey, we made missteps because, we're human. We're just trying to find our way. We're a group made up of people. That's what makes up companies and brands. And we're just trying to figure out the best way of, how we intersect with everybody else. Because I think that, if you do take this approach where you're going to run it like a corporate social responsibility program, that's going to fail because that's just, issuing press releases and showing all the work that you're doing. And it's tied to like monetization and good causes. I think, in some respects, people want to see a little bit more humanity, in this era right now, just because we're not surrounded by so much of it. I mean, we're really surrounded by this echo chamber of sort of technology that is soulless at times, and I think a little, harsh on allowing us to sort of freely express ourselves.
Yeah, and just building on that, I think one of the things that you really nailed is this idea of yelling at each other. And I feel like that is the watch out for brands who want to do activism is no one needs another person yelling into this mix. So like, don't become an activist brand just to raise your voice. I feel like no one needs to hear you raise your voice just for the sake of raising your voice. So I agree. I think you have to pick and choose when to raise your voice and whether to raise your voice. But I also think in terms of brand activism, and this is to your point about humanity, I think there's a great opportunity for brands to really embrace humility.
Yes.
And I actually think that would be an interesting proactive stance for a brand to take. Forget being an activist, not to say that there aren't important issues that brands should use their platforms and power to affect.
Yep.
But for most brands, I think embracing a strategy of humility, public humility, and saying, we are eager to learn, we are eager to grow, we're going to talk to you about our mistakes, we're going to publicly tell you what we're going to do to fix those mistakes, and for humility to actually be their guiding voice, I think would be really refreshing, because you can't get something from humility as immediately, and it's less of an insecure posture. I always find arrogance to be a very insecure posture.
Yes.
And it takes arrogance to feel like your voice needs to be louder than other people's. Whereas a brand that is able to embrace its flaws, like you said, and really be humble in a world that's so noisy and arrogant, I think that would be a refreshing way to bring us back to our humanity a bit.
Brands go through what people go through. You may not know that humility until a little bit more into your existence. And we've talked again about this on, past episodes of the podcast. If you're a startup and you're, depending on who makes up the company, you are going to probably be brash and arrogant and make a lot of mistakes. But once you learn from a lot of that, you hopefully learn more humility, which is the better way to be in life. But I don't think you can really be humble without realizing what the mistakes are of being arrogant. So, again, I don't give brands a free pass for, hey, just go out and be arrogant and troll everyone. But I think some will make some mistakes because they may come across a specific way they don't intend, and others see it as arrogant and they're like, oh, whoa, this is not, let's dial it way back. This is just not the way to be, and let's be a lot more immersive. I do agree with you though. I think being much more immersive in this always shouting society that we live in is just the way to go now. It's actually how you attract attention more, because you're not out there shouting. So the people who do value you are like, okay, that's what they stand for. That's what I stand for. I love that. And they can really bond with you a lot more than everybody else who's like, hey, look at us. We stand for these things too, just because it's the big, shiny, bright thing of the moment, when, a year ago, they wouldn't even be caught dead talking about a lot of these issues. And even under the surface, Cheryl, some of these companies, the biggest problem they have is they may go out and say, we believe in equal pay for females, and we believe in diversity and inclusivity, and we believe in all these other things. And then you look under the hood and they don't practice it. So that's the bigger problem. It's so easy to talk about words. It's much more difficult to talk about actions. And I know that is something that you and I believe in, that it's really an era of action.
Yes.
Actions and results now, more than just talking about things. If we're going to continue to do that, conversations only, can take you so far before people start to not trust you, which goes back to the theme of trust.
Yeah. And I would basically summarize it by saying, there's only one Larry David, and that's for a reason, because you can only take a person like that in small doses. The world doesn't need every brand to be Larry David, or for us to be trapped in a cocktail with all Larry Davids. It's like that doesn't work. You need other people to be sane in order for the Larry Davids of the world to have their charm. So I definitely think brands should think about whether they're the normal person in the room or if they're the Larry David.
Awesome. Great takeaways as always. Make sure you give us feedback. We're on Twitter at Disruptive FM. You can also partake in the conversation by using the hashtag Disruptive FM, wherever hashtags may be supported. And Cheryl, where are you again on Twitter?
I'm at The Real Cheryl M.
And I'm at DJGEOFFE. Another episode of Disruptive FM. We'll catch you next time.
Call it any way you want. The sun will always
You've been listening to Disruptive FM, the marketing podcast for eccentric minds.
You've been listening to an episode of Disruptive FM, the marketing podcast for eccentric minds. Remember to subscribe to the show on iTunes. Purchase a copy of Geoffrey's latest book, Disruptive Marketing, on Kindle, hardcover and audio. Signing off from the city of Seattle. Press pause.